Good evening and welcome to Face for the Newsfirst team. I'm Niresh. Well, the fighting in the Middle East is going on and it doesn't look like there's an end in sight. And over the last few days, it took a decided turn for the worse because it extended not just from the Strait of Hormuz, but went all the way to the Red Sea, where two Saudi oil tankers were attacked by the Houthis of Yemen. So more and more players are getting involved or dragged into this conflict. And more importantly, the shipping lane through the Suez Canal and the Red Sea is now at risk. And hopefully that will be sorted out soon, or the whole world is going to suffer. And to discuss all this, I have with me one of my regular guests on international affairs, Mr. Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies, CLAS. Good evening and welcome back, Nilanthan.
Good evening, Nilesh. Thank you for having me.
So we seem to meet when the crisis exacerbates and there's something which gets worse. And over the last few days, things did get worse. How bad are they right now with this spread into the Red Sea?
Yes, so the business of war is very decisively back in business. We have two choke points.
The business of war, yes.
We have two choke points now being involved. Of course, the Strait of Hormuz, but then the Bab el-Mandeb Strait as well. And the major problem that we are facing here right now is that if we thought the previous problem had too many warring factions with no real capacity for a ceasefire or a resolution, this compounds that 100 times. Because now not only are we adding simply the Houthis to the board, you're adding the entire question of an Arab identity on board, because the Yemeni insurgency is one of the fundamental points of divergence even between the Saudis and the Emiratis. So if you remember, the major reason that the Saudis and the Emiratis kind of had a split in their friendship, so to speak, was because the Saudis felt that the Emiratis were undermining them by supporting the Southern Transitional Council in Yemen, which is a separatist group, while Saudi Arabia is supporting the Yemeni government. And this has bled into a number of other conflicts in the region as well. For example, Saudi Arabia supports the Sudanese government, while the UAE supports the RSF in the Sudan. In Somalia, for example, Saudi Arabia supports the unified Somalian government, while the Emiratis support Somaliland and those breakaway factions. So we see this pattern emerging now where the Arab world, the Gulf region, and the states around it are very heavily affected by this Saudi-Emirati rivalry. And it all starts in Yemen. It all comes down to a resolution in Yemen. And therefore, the entire chessboard that we speak has now become far more complex.
Now, Nilanthan, what you just outlined is something which people outside the Middle East don't generally know about. But if you live in the Middle East, if you're from the Middle East, you would know a little bit about these things. But, I'm just thinking Donald Trump sitting in Washington wouldn't really understand the nuances of the Arab world, whereas the Iranian government certainly does, and their support for the Houthis in Yemen over so many years certainly was calculated to create this split and exacerbate it, don't you think?
Yes, the UAE is accused of playing a very disruptive role in the entire region, because what we see is Saudi Arabia supporting the incumbent governments, while UAE typically tends to support some kind of paramilitary separatist force. So that's that. Now, in terms of how aware the Americans are of this calculus, the Americans are forced into a position where they have to be aware of it, because the GCC's entire functioning has been held hostage. So the Americans know that the GCC, which if you remember in 81, 82, was kind of created as an anti-Iran sort of body to begin with. That GCC now, the reason why they are strategically split is because of the Saudi Emirati rivalry. So the Americans are certainly aware of it, at least because of that one component. But I'm not too sure whether anybody, whether it's the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians or anybody, can they really reconcile these two Arab powers? I don't think so, because the Saudis are very entrenched in the idea that they are the center of gravity as far as Arab geopolitics goes. And the UAE is now of the steadfast opinion that their time has now come to shine and that they can't be dependent on the Saudis forever. So even in that front, it's a bit of an incompatible problem without any end in sight.
So this is the jostling for power and influence within the Middle East. And of course, one wonders whether Donald Trump understands this at all, or whether it's just, a whole bunch of Arab nations to him. Do you think he calculated on the Houthis intervening in the Red Sea at this point? Because this is something that you and I discussed this, when the Iran conflict began, which was in late February. And we discussed the fact that the Strait of Hormuz is bad enough, but if it spreads to the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the strait which connects the Red Sea and the Indian Ocean, it would get much worse, because that is on the main shipping route of the world, not just the Middle East. If you've got a shipment going from New York to Singapore, it's coming through there. So it's containerized cargo, other types of freight, and of course the oil and gas and all that. So we sort of expected this from the Houthis, and it was a little bit of a surprise that they didn't get involved for quite some time. A welcome surprise. But now they seem to be involved. How involved are they? Is this likely to go on, these threats to shipping in the Red Sea? Or is it likely to die down? Is it that the Houthis were simply making a point, or are they really serious about this?
So I think it's a mix of both. It boils down to the fact that the Houthis have deep ties with the IRGC, and the IRGC and the Iranian government are currently at odds with each other as well, where there are members of the Iranian government who do want some kind of peace, some kind of resolution, but there are certain renegade factions within the IRGC who personally benefit from the idea of collecting a toll, who personally benefit from the idea of patrolling that choke point, who have a lot of personal material gains to be made from that kind of shift in power. So what we see is now a lot of these IRGC renegades have now started encouraging the Houthis to get back into the fray. Because earlier, as you rightly pointed out, it was a welcome surprise that the Houthis were not involved in it. In fact, the Houthi-Saudi ceasefire has actually lasted, on the land at least, for about 4 years at this point, and it was going very well. There are two conflicts here. One is the Houthi civil war with the Yemenis government, and the other is Houthis versus the commercial shipping traffic in the Red Sea. So the ceasefire with the Saudis had been holding for about 4 years at this point, until now. So I don't think most people thought the Houthis would get into it, but once the Yemenis government took credit for attacking the Sana'a airport, unfortunately, it was just a matter of time before the Houthis.
Right. So the incident which sparked the Houthis to come into this conflict was, I think, about 10 days ago, when an aircraft from Iran, which was apparently carrying members of the IRGC and drone equipment and so on, was going to land at Sana'a airport, which is the capital of
international airport,
the international airport of Yemen. but the Saudis had fired on the airport, forcing this aircraft to land somewhere else in Yemen.
Yes.
So it did get to its destination.
It did.
In
And
the end,
the Yemenis claimed it was them, that
the
it was a
Yemeni
government-sanctioned action. The Houthis were like, we don't really consider this to be an attack by the government of Yemen. This was a Saudi attack, and therefore we will retaliate. So some people say that the Saudis deliberately drew the Houthis into the war by doing this. Some say that the Houthis deliberately pulled themselves into the war by associating a Yemeni attack with a Saudi attack. So depending on which side you support, you just accuse the other of drawing you into the war. And that's what's happened. I mean, the history of the Houthis itself is very interesting, right? So as you probably know, Yemen had, if I'm not mistaken, the only Arab communist, government. There were two Yemens, just like how there were two Koreas, two Germanys. There were two Yemens.
North Yemen and South
Yemen. Now it was called whatever, Republic of Yemen, Emirates of Yemen, whatever. So, and in 1990, when there was reunification, since then, the idea of a Yemenis, whatever you want to call it, identity has always been very turbulent. There's been no national identity, national unity, like with many post-Cold War nations that got reunified. And since then, the government has been repeatedly trying to, squash this kind of dissent, founded by a guy called Hussein al-Houthi, after whom the Houthis are named. And after the Arab Spring is where the government really found itself in a huge fix, because it was already an authoritarian government. Yemen is already a very poor country by comparison to, their neighbors. So there was a lot of discontent, and the government had to come to some kind of compromise with civil society after lots of protests and tear gas and all of that. But what they didn't realize is that during this time that they were negotiating with civil society, to the point where even the president had to step down, during this time, the Houthis, who had nothing to do with the Arab Spring, had capitalized by militarily taking over many towns in western Yemen. And with that, it was too late to stop them. A lot of back and forth fighting. There was an Arab coalition to kind of take them out, which led to accusations of, war crimes, crimes against humanity, bombing hospitals.
The Arab coalition was led by Saudi Arabia.
Saudi Arabia.
Yes. But included Emirates.
Absolutely. And this is where the split starts to happen between the Saudis and the Emiratis, where the Saudis claim that the Emiratis are undermining them. And then after that, somehow there's a ceasefire in 2022, but the Houthis are still a big danger to global shipping traffic. So the Americans try to come in. In November 2024, the largest naval battle since World War II is fought between the Americans and the Houthis. A lot of people don't know this, that just recently in November 2024 was the largest naval battle since World War II, where for something like 8 hours, the Americans had to shoot off sustained drone and projectile attacks from the Houthis. Very, very tense, harsh kind of exchange of fire. And then the Americans had to change their tactics. And by January 2025, once Trump came in, the Americans kind of withdrew from that operation. So it's hard for us to tell now what exactly the American reaction will be. Would it be more of a prolonged engagement? Would it be encouraging the Saudis for a land invasion? Would it be, taking on the mantle of that themselves? We are not too sure. But all we know is that the Houthis cannot be dealt with simply from the water. You need to go into the land to deal with them, and that requires political resolve.
Well, at this point in time, is any country willing to put boots on the ground? We've seen that the Americans certainly are very much against boots on the ground against Iran. That's why this has been an air war and not a land war. And with Yemen, the likelihood is that the Saudis would not want to get involved in a land war, because they were involved. As you said, then there was a ceasefire 4 years ago. So would they actually want to get involved? Because the Saudis have not actually traditionally being the military type,
Yeah, to put it
they
lightly.
they
Yes.
they, they tend to bankroll conflicts
Yes.
rather than get involved themselves.
Yes, yes. And this compounds the problem because even though they have many allies, as you rightly pointed out, their indigenous capacity still has a lot in it that can be questioned. I mean, even now, the Saudi F-35s and the Saudi F-15s are just sitting in some hangar somewhere, not involved in any of these military operations at all. So that requires, as you rightly pointed out, far more willpower and far more dedication than simply an air campaign. And whether the Saudi government right now would actually want to go down that path is a big question, which probably emboldens the Houthis even more.
And also, Nilanthan, the Saudi infrastructure, especially the oil and gas installations, are very vulnerable, aren't they? Because there have been Houthi attacks on the Saudi installations, which have proven to be fairly effective. So if if that is done on a large scale, Saudi Arabia would really lose out.
Yeah, and if that's done on a large scale, the Houthis would certainly be inviting the Saudis to now muster that resolve that the Saudis have perhaps been a bit reluctant to muster. The Houthi strategy right now seems to be, let's just block off the Red Sea with the Bab el Mandeb, because most of the energy that the Saudis would typically export through Hormuz, they've been doing it through Yenbo. And for Yenbo, you need to go through the Red Sea and the Bab el Mandeb and all that for that oil to come out. So this basically cuts off that plan B that the Saudis would have in the long run as well. So remember, this is not just a short-term play. If we look at the Gulf in general, the Strait of Hormuz chokes off Bahrain, Oman, and Qatar. That's the three GCC countries that the strait completely cuts out from the rest of the world. The Emiratis and the Saudis, the two powerful members of the GCC, they have long-term alternatives. The UAE has Fujairah, and the Saudis, at least before the Houthis kind of blocked it, had the pipelines, and they were adding more pipelines, alternative pipelines. So the Emiratis and the Saudis, it felt like over the long run, they were not going to be squeezed as much as their Arab neighbors. And that perhaps meant that the GCC itself was not putting as much pressure. I mean, it's when the powerful get squeezed that an organization exerts pressure, right? So now the Saudis are really caught in a fix because that one alternative that they had has been completely cut out. So they have to do something, and maybe the Houthis will end up forcing the Saudis to do precisely what the Saudis are reluctant to do.
Right. Now, let's talk about the impact of even closing the Bab el Mandeb for, let's say, a month. This is a route where approximately 30% of the world's containerized cargo goes through, as well as other types of cargo. Everything that's going between Asia and Europe is going through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. So it has a major impact on China, on India, on the Southeast Asian economies, and even Japan, perhaps.
Yeah.
So this is now a whole different ball game, isn't it?
Yes, and it's a major lesson over the last 4 to 5 months that all Asian economies have learned, which is that they've been far too reliant on West Asia, especially West Asian choke points, for their own energy and resource security, and that they need to now diversify. And you could say in that way, maybe that was the American intent all along. That American intent all along was to now destabilize the Strait of Hormuz and force all of these countries to now diversify. And they are the only options that we can diversify to. So in that sense, it's a long run gain for the industrial exporters of the United States. And it's a question of whether the Asian economies can actually capitalize on that. If we could just use oil prices as an example, a lot of experts predicted that oil would go up to 150, even $200 dollars a barrel and all that, global speculative benchmark oil prices. It didn't really do that. It didn't crack 120, 125. Now that's when we look at the speculative WTI, Brent, those ones. But if we look at the landed Asian cost, like Dubai oil, for example, which is a much more accurate measure of oil prices in Asia, those spiked up to something like 170. There was a massive spike. So Asia has been hit by this in a way that the rest of the world has simply not been hit. It's almost like a sledgehammer. And it all comes down to whether Asia can learn this lesson and diversify away from that as quickly as they can. And we already see this happening. American oil and gas imports are at an all-time high. Almost all of that going to Asian markets. And these Asian markets are now starting to respond to that as well. The semiconductor industry, which needs a lot of helium. Right now, Qatar was the big helium provider to all these semiconductor companies in East Asia. Now, TSMC, Taiwan's semiconductor, just a few days ago, 4 or 5 days ago, announced something like a $265 billion package to set up a chip manufacturing infrastructure in the United States. 265 billion is more than the Saudi, Kuwaiti, Iranian annual oil revenue of 2024 combined. So because the United States is the only place that can provide helium other than Qatar. So for a semiconductor industry, if Qatar is out of the picture, you have to go to the Americans for that helium. So the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz is also going to recalibrate Asian-American relations in an industrial sense.
Some major impacts indeed. We need to take a short break now. I'm in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
මමත් නෑනේ බං ඉස්කෝලේ. මේක මොනවා කරගන්න ඉද්දන්නේ?
අනේ මොයින බේන මාසි.
ආශි මෙහෙනම්
උදන්න ඔය රංගිරි කට ගෑ. එයි මම තනියෙන් ගා ගන්න මොකද?
මමත් ඉස්කෝලේ යන කාලේ ඔය වගේම තාප්පෙන් පැන්නා.
ඔබ තාම ඔය ඇක්සිඩන්ට් එක පස්සේ යනවනේ බං.
මේක ඇක්සිඩන්ට් එකක් නෙමෙයි ලොකු.
Welcome back to Face to Face. I'm in conversation with Nilanthan Niruthan, who is the Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies class. Now, Nilanthan, we were talking about how Asia has responded, but something that's been a bit of a surprise is the manner in which China seems to have managed this oil crisis. Many people expected China to be really badly hit because much of its oil and gas is from the Middle East. But yes, there have been some hits to the Chinese economic growth, but it seems to be doing a lot better than expected.
Absolutely. In fact, you could almost say it's a case study for nations with resources and policy on how to deal with an energy crisis. You're absolutely right. Even up till, let's say, a year ago, if you had asked most people what China's major vulnerability was, they would have said China is too dependent on commodities imports and energy imports, and that's China's big Achilles heel, their weakness, so to speak. But China has displayed far more resilience than almost any other country when the Strait of Hormuz got shut. And there are certain long-term plays that they made and certain short-term plays that they made as well. Their long-term energy strategy is energy security over energy ethics. And what I mean by that is China burns more coal than the rest of the world combined. China is currently building out more nuclear reactors than the rest of the world combined. Of course, the Americans have more nuclear reactors at the moment, but the largest expansion of nuclear power plants, China. China is the world's largest provider of renewable energy in terms of solar and wind power. China has invested more than every other country combined in terms of the coal to chemical process. So almost everything we see here around us today requires some kind of petrochemical. And China has discovered ways in which you can start off with raw coal, and through chemical processes, you can turn them into, petrochemical products. So in all domains of energy, regardless of what the moral or ethical or legal or whatever concerns are, China looked at energy strategically, and they've expanded into all kinds of areas of energy. So even if there's disruption in oil, there are others. So that's one. They've diversified their energy platform, so to speak. The second is that China has also been able to make use of what we call offshore oil inventories. So when you look at Google, you go to the internet, you see these people sharing global oil inventories on Twitter and whatever. Those are what we call onshore oil inventories. But there are also offshore oil inventories. There's many ships floating all over the world carrying large quantities of oil, which are not in these statistics and record books. And China has been able to tap into that as well. China has also been able to tap into its strategic petroleum reserve, not as much as we thought they did, because they have a much larger reserve than everyone else. They tapped into that a little bit, but mostly offshore diversification. They immediately banned the export of petrochemical products, which meant that all of those guys now had an internal market they had to focus on to bring the price down. So China had a very multifaceted approach to energy security. And it's something that I think even a small nation like us should learn from. Often poor nations who cannot afford to compromise on their energy security, for whatever reason, don't take their energy security that seriously. We need to consider especially the building out of energy infrastructure and the building out of energy reserve infrastructure very seriously.
Excellent. So a lot of lessons to be had from China. What about the Indian economy? How resilient is India when you look at the fact that, again, much of its petroleum imports are from the Middle East?
Yeah. So India had a big problem when this first broke out, especially with, gas, because you've got to remember that India has had its own energy revolution in a sense. So around the year 2000, about 25 years ago, Indians approximately used about something like 12 million tons of kerosene or something like that. And today it's less than a million because they've all gone into these LPG cylinders. So over the last 25 years, the Indian domestic consumer market has moved from kerosene into LPG. And because there were disruptions, that really hit India. But look, overall, if you were to compare India with a country like Japan, India is in a much better position. In fact, India's energy imports are now kind of at pre-war levels, particularly before the last few days when things spiked up. Whereas a country like Japan, for instance, because of the crash of their own currency, they were not able to get back up to pre-war levels. So the Indians were hit quite bad, but certainly not as bad as some of the East Asian economies who've been hit the worst out of this entire lot.
Right. Now let's talk about a possible long-term resolution to what's going on in the Middle East. Right now, Donald Trump doesn't seem to know what to do. He just keeps threatening Iran. That doesn't seem to work. Iran clearly is intent on playing a long game and outlasting Donald Trump. And the outlasting, well, there are elections, crucial midterm elections coming up in November. And we are now almost in August. So basically in about 3 months' time, three and a half months, you have these elections to the US Senate and the House of Representatives. And that is where Donald Trump's party, the Republican Party, controls both houses at the moment, but barely just. So, you know, should he lose one or both houses, he would have a serious problem with anything that he wants to do, including finding money for the war.
Yeah. But at the same time, a lot of the people, even in the Democrat Party, who might in front of a television camera say Trump is an idiot, how are they going to reverse his policies when American oil exports are at a record high, American gas exports are at a record high, America's semiconductor manufacturing industry is at a record high, American weapons exports are at a record. I mean, all these countries using up their, weaponry and all that, where are they going to get it back from? They need to go back to the Lockheed Martins and the Raytheons of the world. So given that Trump's, what many of us might call a disastrous policy for the world, given that it's been such a steroid-like shot in the arm for the American industrial or manufacturing base, what are the Democrats going to do to undermine all this chaos, even if they had the power, considering that this is all funneling back into America's reindustrialization? So while it might be a personal embarrassment for Trump if he loses, number one, it's very common for incumbent presidents to lose the midterm elections. That's not a new thing at all. It happens with everybody essentially. But even if someone else takes over, how are they going to reverse any of this, given the sheer, the kind of industrial renaissance that this conflict has created inside of the United States?
The business of war, as
the
you
business
mentioned.
of war.
Yes. So that's a very interesting point. And this is something which is generally hidden from public view, isn't it? That there are interests behind the scenes who maneuver the players on the board.
Absolutely. And in fact, you and I have discussed this many times before about how so many people who are experts in this field, they might be able to recite the UN Charter, but they wouldn't know what the price of a barrel of oil is on that given day, even though the price of a barrel of oil dictates geopolitics to a far more, tangible degree than the UN Charter. So, and this is where geopolitical analysis in a material sense becomes very important. This is where studying energy, currency, choke points, all of these become the primary modes through which we understand the world, because all of this other surface level political stuff never really tells us the truth. In fact, the political rhetoric you you could say, is intentionally designed to keep us distracted from the truth. Follow the money, as I always say.
Absolutely. But what about the Gulf countries? What is their fate in all of this? Because before the war, they were doing quite well. The entire region, they were developing fast, and they had grand plans which were in motion economically. Everything seemed to be turning out fine for them. They didn't get dragged into the Gaza conflict, and so they were doing well.
Yes.
But now they are doing badly.
Yes.
Because you can't have all these drones and missiles flying around.
Yes.
And then your airspace closes, and then tomorrow your airspace opens up again. So it's disruptive, isn't it?
It's very disruptive. At least as far as the Saudis and the Emiratis were concerned, particularly the Saudis before the recent Bab el-Mandeb pressure, the Saudis and the Emiratis to a certain extent were not as bothered. If I'm selling a barrel of oil that I used to sell for 60 at 120 now, that means that even if I'm only selling half of what I used to earlier, I'm not really facing a hit. While Bahrain, Oman, these were the countries that were really facing the squeeze. So in that sense, there was a little bit less of an incentive for the GCC giants to exert a lot of pressure out of their own initiative. It might change now. I mean, look, overall, it would be a mistake for us to look at the Gulf as a unified entity, because ultimately what we can see is that all of these countries have vastly different geopolitical aims to a certain extent. For some countries like Bahrain, it's simply survival. For some countries like Saudi, it's about retaining their supremacy over the Arab world. For some people like the UAE, it's about stamping their own identity. So once again, many different pieces to the puzzle going in different directions.
Now let's talk about the countries which tried to bring a diplomatic solution to this. Pakistan and also Qatar.
Yes.
And I think to a lesser extent Oman. The Pakistanis were very active.
Yes.
Over the first 3 months of this conflict. You had the Pakistani Prime Minister, the Defense Minister, the Army Chief, all of them shuttling back and forth, and they were very much the heroes of the hour.
Yes.
All eyes were on them. How would they bring these parties to the table? And they did manage it. It was quite difficult, and of course there's really no way that these parties can really talk, because their points of view are just poles apart, basically.
Yes.
And when they were brought to the table in Pakistan, I think they spoke something like discussed for 30 hours or something, and then went home, and no resolution.
Yes.
But we did get a ceasefire.
Yes.
Which lasted for a few weeks. But now the Pakistanis are very quiet. You don't hear of them doing anything.
Yes.
Does this mean that they are really quiet? Are they working behind the scenes? What's going on?
So they're still working behind the scenes, but the thing is that the Pakistanis always had a worry that there was no political cohesion on the Iranian side. And now their worries have proven to be true, where you can negotiate with the team and then find out that the IRGC has a completely different idea. And then when you approach the IRGC, you find out that there are rebel factions inside the IRGC who cannot be controlled, who have personal, financial gains to be made from this, and they have the loyalty of the people on the ground. So there's nothing really that you can do, because it's a decentralized leadership, right? To prevent the Americans and the Israelis from decapitating the Iranians. The flow of command itself, as we've discussed before, is to be able to tolerate those shocks on top. So the guys at the bottom on the ground have a lot of power. And this is now a kind of biting Iran in the behind, so to speak. Pakistan's advantage is that Pakistan is on very good terms with both the United States and China. Pakistan is one of the only countries in the world where even the Prime Minister can say, the United States is our big brother, China is our big brother, and get away with it. Like an Indian politician saying that would get lynched. Imagine an Indian politician saying China is our big brother. Political suicide. Pakistan's one of the few countries where you could say that of the Americans and the Chinese, and it would still fit into your political system. So fair play to them for making use of that platform, for presenting themselves as the representatives of a kind of, global sentiment to resolve this. But yeah, Iran is just too much of the Iranian leadership is just too fragmented at this point for any kind of meaningful ceasefire agreement.
There's also the question of the IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps, which is so powerful, and it became powerful during the time of Ayatollah Khomeini, and it has continued, it has evolved, but its power, I think they have found a new source of power in the sense that they control the Strait of Hormuz. Is that one of the key aspects of the IRGC's power?
I think so. In fact, to be honest, it almost feels like they were egged into this. It wasn't the IRGC that first started saying they would control the Strait of Hormuz. If you go back and look at the literature, it's these Western security, intellectuals and experts who were like, oh, they can control the Strait of Hormuz, they can control the Strait of Hormuz, and who just kept banging that point on over and over again. And ultimately, the IRGC played that card. But you can only play that card once, as we've seen. You can play that card once, you can create a lot of disruption. Then once that game is done, you can't restart the game because all kinds of alternatives would have already been built. We already see that the doom and gloom that a lot of people predicted did not play out because global systems were a lot more resilient than we thought. Countries like Australia, Indonesia, Japan, South Korea, which were about to shut off their coal refineries, started back up coal. Countries like Pakistan, for domestic electricity, started importing a lot of solar panels from China. In general, countries are moving away from oil towards gas. There's one Texan city called Bluemont, which has more energy in it than the whole country of Iran. This is a small city in Texas, but natural gas is far more abundant in the world than crude oil. Crude oil is, you pay a premium for it because all our existing engines, most of it, is built to run on crude oil. But once crude oil becomes difficult to access, you just change the engine and you start using natural gas. And all of this becomes irrelevant almost overnight, as quickly as those engines can be updated. So eventually, what this might lead to is a decline in the use of crude oil itself, and natural gas kind of replacing it as the premier hydrocarbon in the world. We are already seeing this transition happening. The Chinese didn't buy any LNG from the Americans for a year, but then last May, they had to capitulate and start buying liquefied natural gas from the Americans again. So we will start seeing that oil to gas global shift.
Right, and there doesn't seem to be any resolution at the moment, but I'm sure that there'll be further developments over the coming weeks, and we can meet once again to discuss that. And I'm afraid we are now out of time. So thank you very much to Nilanthan Niruthan.
Thank you.
Executive Director of the Center for Law and Security Studies class. Thank you very much. And thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away because the news is coming up next. Have a great evening.